Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights, and let the dread begin. I was telling this story to my children. They had just come back from a visit to their paternal grandparents, and the younger one piped up and asked, "Mummy, where did your parents go? You always talk about them, but we never get to see them." My husband and I locked eyes for a moment, and we both realized that it was time. There are some things that you cannot hide forever. After I finished speaking, they sat in silence. The younger one then spoke up again. "Mummy," she asked, her voice quavering, "could you tell us again what happened to you in Kangra?" I almost laughed out loud. Of course that was the thing that they were interested in. Not in my tragic family history, but the inexplicable. The things that couldn't be easily rationalized away as human hate and fear. So I told them again, and I noticed that they really looked scared. But then again, I realized that I had told and not told my story. I had told my children the sensitized version, the one appropriate for 8 and 6-year-olds. The version in which all of the blood and gore and piss is carefully removed. I told them what happened to my parents and what had happened in Kangra, but had glossed over the parts that were most meaningful to me. So I decided to come here. I need to get this off my chest. My husband knows my history as well, and he was the one who encouraged me to speak. My parents loved to tell me the story of how they met. My father was walking home from class, struggling with a stack of mock examinations for the Indian Civil Services. It was raining, he slipped, and his precious notes went flying into the open gutters and potholed road. My mother had just stepped out of her house to go buy chicken. "I remember this," she said, "because my mother told me off when I got home. I had completely forgotten to buy it." And the sight of my poor bespectacled father sitting in the muddy road must have been hilarious to her, because she giggled. This enraged my father, who yelled at her and then started crying. "I wasn't crying," he grumbled. "It must have been the rain." My mother apologized. One thing led to another, and suddenly they were eloping and running away from their small village. My father was the son of a well-respected Kashmiri pundit. My mother was the daughter of an imam. Both of my grandfathers were incredibly pissed. While Hindus and Muslims usually coexisted somewhat peacefully, their communities didn't really mix that much. My father's eyes usually darkened at this point, and sometimes he would make an excuse and leave the room. My mother's eyes would follow him, and she would sigh and shake her head. He was very close to his father. "When he disowned your Papa didn't leave the house for a week." "What about your father?" I asked, perched in her lap. She chuckled and gave one of my braids a twist. "Oh, he was an awful old man." She would then look sad, and her eyes would look far, far away. "I miss my mother, though. She was strict, but she would make the best sweet rice. And I remember when I memorized a particularly difficult poem when I was younger, and she gave me a little doll as a present. She would also tell the best stories. And usually at that point, she switched to another story about the ghosts that live in the valleys in North India. My father would come back into the room, having finished his brooding, and would oblige my mother by making scary sounds at the appropriate times. Mother told me of ghosts in the trees that would pretend to be monkeys, and would jump on and strangle unsuspecting travelers. She told me of beasts that were impossibly tall and thin that traveled on all fours and ran faster than cars, chasing down and spiriting away small children at night. Her favorite ghost was the Chudale. The Chudale was the spirit of a woman who had been abused during her lifetime. After her death, she would wander the forests and rivers, with inverted palms and wild hair, and trick people into coming close. My father faithfully would make these imitations, and I would squeal with delight and fear, running around the house and hiding under the beds and in the closets. Even though their story was sad, they told it many times. I loved reliving their memories in my mind. My tall, somber father sitting in the middle of the road bawling his eyes out. My light-hearted mother laughing, mirth on her face, but growing more and more concerned as my father's weeping intensified. My mind always skipped over the running away part, though. It didn't sit well with me and always made me sad. Still, I think they wanted me to know where I came from. Perhaps it was a preparation for the prying eyes and whispered gossip of the neighbors. Even though my parents had moved to a more liberal area, unions like theirs were still an anomaly. Their marriage wasn't like a Bollywood film, in which the lovers get together and ride off in the sunset with "just married" written on the back of their ambassador card. They were cut off from their families. They both had to give up things. My mother, who loved kebabs, gave up every form of meat out of respect for my father. During Ramadan, my father took some leave from his government job, took care of all household chores, and cooked meals for us while my mother would spend her day quietly praying. They both agreed that having twice as many festivals to celebrate was fun, though. My mother told me of the first time she held a firecracker during Diwali. It was so loud, I thought that it was going to blow my hand off. My father never knew how much his stomach was capable of carrying until my mother force-fed him during Eid. As their only child, I was well cared for. They both introduced me to their respective holy books, and I grew up with a solid grounding in both the Quran and the Gita. I was a good student in school as well, and my classmates didn't seem to care too much that I had a Muslim first name and a Hindu surname, although I did get queer looks and snarky comments at times. I was 10 when my life changed completely. It was just after New Year's Day, 1990. My father had had a worried look on his face for the past several months. Late at night, I would pretend to be asleep in the living room and listen to my parents discuss things such as unrest and killings. They agreed to leave Kashmir at the end of January and moved to Dharamshala. The thought of leaving my beautiful home filled me with grief, but I too had heard of the muttered alarm from the people on the radio, and I saw the hate in my neighbors' eyes. January 19th, 1990. The fear in my parents' eyes turned into pure terror. Some leaders had said that all Kashmiri pundits must leave, convert, or die. My parents didn't even bother to hide their conversations from me this time. I remember my mother shakily asking my father to convert for the time being, just to keep up appearances. My father slammed the table with an open palm, and my mother grabbed his arm and begged him to reconsider for my sake. My father shook his head and said that they would be leaving in 2 days, and that we shouldn't bother with fake conversions and instead start packing. My memories become fuzzy at this time. I don't remember exactly what happened. Yelling and jeering from outside of our house. A broken window. My mother screaming. My intimidating and soft-spoken father, who voraciously tore through books and pretended to be monsters to entertain me, dragged outside and kicked in the head. Tears streamed down his face, and the night sky had not a single cloud, so as much as I'd like to blame the rain, I can't. His white kurta stained yellow. Later I realized that he had pissed himself. The cold muzzle of a gun, a sword, some knives. My mother didn't stop screaming for a long time. After my father died, my mother did end up moving with me to Dharamshala. She was very quiet and didn't speak to me for a long time, which terrified me. This shell of a person was not how I knew my mother. After some time, she became more like her normal self and even laughed once or twice. We had moved in with one of my mother's friends. Mother spent a lot of time looking for work and eventually found employment at the post office, and I threw myself into my schoolwork in order to forget my grief. Sometimes, though, I would see a pair of glasses that looked like my father's, or a shawl like the one he wore, and I would burst into tears. Her friend, who I called Ani, was very nice to me and very poor. She had many children, and I spent a lot of evenings playing with them and telling them the same ghost stories my grandmother had told my mother. Most of our belongings had been destroyed before we moved and our money stolen, so we were barely better off than Auntie. In Dharamshala, we lived in a slum that had many Hindu and Muslim residents, and also had a fair amount of Sikhs and Buddhists. Like Kashmir, we usually lived together well, but unlike my parents' Kashmiri community, we spent a lot of time together and depended on each other because many of us were poor. It was not uncommon for the neighbors to share leftovers with the families that were doing poorly. We had to be as casual as possible about it. If we straight up made them food, their pride would have been offended. Leftovers were easier to justify taking. I often went with my Hindu neighbors and to the temple on religious holidays, and I played cricket with their children every evening. So when they suddenly turned against us, I was shocked. There had been more talks about riots, as a cow was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The Hindu accused of killing it, he and the cow's owner had some land disputes, if I recall correctly, suddenly mentioned that he saw a couple of Muslim boys throwing stones at it, and the rumor quickly buzzed around our part of town. I had other things to be concerned with at that time, though. That evening, I had gone out with Mother to the bazaar. I was 13 then, and had just started my period, so my mother decided to buy some feminine products for me. We got home later in the evening, and were greeted by the burning inferno of our house, the flames licking the twilight sky. There were more men with sticks and swords, and my mother quickly ripped off her headscarf, took my bindi and put it on herself, grabbed my hand, and dragged me through the crowd to one of our Sikh neighbors' houses. 2 of Ani's children died in the fire, and this time it was her screams that pierced the night. My mother died rather quickly after. We had moved into a slum while my mother tried to save up some money to buy a house somewhere else. She probably drank some bad water, and then started to throw up. We couldn't afford a doctor, and I watched as she rapidly deteriorated. In a week she was dead. Her last moments were spent incoherently mumbling my father's name, my name, and some holy names. This time, instead of crying, I stared at her body numbly as she was buried. I was orphaned and alone at the age of 13, and I realized that I had nowhere to go. Ani wanted to take me in, but her husband had some trepidations about raising a child that was not his. Rightfully so, may I add. Even with 2 dead children, Ani's husband still had 6 mouths to feed, not including myself. So Ani did what she could, and got one of my relatively affluent Sikh neighbors, the one that had protected my mother and myself during the riots, to search for and contact any of my remaining relatives. As it turned out, one of my mother's brothers had married and left Kashmir and was living in Chandigarh. We used Sarabjit Singh's phone call my uncle, and I spoke on the phone with him for the first time. He cried hearing my voice, and cried again when I told him my mother was dead. 2 months later, it was all arranged. I would travel by taxi from Dharamshala to Chandigarh. It would take 4 days to travel, 5 if it rained too hard. Singh and the rest of the neighborhood pooled their funds and paid the advance fee of 250 rupees, which would be repaid by my uncle at a later time, and the driver would receive another 500 once I was dropped safely. The night before I left, I said goodbye to all of Ani's children. I also said goodbye to Sarabjit Singh and profusely thanked him for his kindness. He laughed and petted my head and wished me good luck for my journey. He then pressed a 100 rupee note into my hand. I vigorously tried to deny the money, but he was firm. "I want you to have a gift from me," he said, his dark eyes searching my face. "It's good luck." I went into my part of the room to pack whatever belongings I had. After I finished packing my toiletries, 2 kurtas and 3 pants, and my own 200 rupees, my late mother's savings, my hand closed around my mother's ta'is. A ta'is is an amulet that contains select verses of the Quran. You probably won't be surprised to learn that I had come to despise organized religion at that point. I neglected to go to the temple during Diwali, ate freely during Ramadan, much to Auntie's horror, and decided that if a God existed, he was a bitch. But right before my mother died, I took her ta'is and placed it in my pocket. And right after I finished packing, I fiddled with the metal chain and ended up placing it around my neck. Mind you, this wasn't out of any religious sentiment, but it was a rather melodramatic reminder of my mother's presence. Morning came. I tearfully hugged Ani, thanked her husband, and we set off. The driver was a churlish man who spoke little. He had a wire-thin mustache, which he was inordinately proud of. Every few minutes or so, he would look in the rear-view mirror and twirl his mustache. I am pretty sure he almost killed a couple of hapless pedestrians due to his vanity. I sat in the back with my suitcase and winced at every pothole that we bounced over. He didn't make much of an impression on me at first, but once or twice I caught him staring at me in the rear-view mirror. For some reason, I felt a bit uncomfortable. We traveled the rest of the day and eventually meandered into the beautiful Kangra Valley. I wish I could tell you more about Kashmir, but I left when I was young and my memories are faint. I soon became very acquainted with the Kangra Valley. Behind us, Dauladhar, the mountain range that is the beginning of the Himalayas, rose and cast its severe shadow across the land. The road twisted and turned down the mountains, and I saw the lush greenery blooming on either side. The Kangra Valley is known as the land of 1,000 gods because of the number of Hindu shrines it hosts. It seemed that every bend in the road had a small temple to Hanuman, Shiva, or the Devi. I was, to be honest, slightly annoyed. Why would anyone need a temple every 500 meters? I found out the answer to that question later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the evening, we pulled up to a roadside restaurant, or a dhaba. The driver and the owner of this restaurant seemed to know each other, as the driver walked up to him, clasped his arm, and began speaking to him in Pahari, a Khomri dialect I was unfamiliar with. I lugged my suitcase into the restaurant and sat on a rickety chair while the driver and the owner talked. The driver and the owner then walked out to the back, but before they did, the driver turned to me. "Stay here. I will be back in a few minutes." Have you ever had an irrational feeling that just springs up from nowhere? That's how I felt in that moment. Something was wrong. I felt like something horrible was about to happen. I realized that when the driver told me to stay here, the last thing I wanted to do was to stay here. Mutely I nodded. He smiled at me, and the heavy atmosphere quickly lifted. He walked inside the dhaba, and I realized that I needed to use the restroom. I had a feeling not to tell anyone or be too obvious about it, so I grabbed my suitcase, to this day I don't know why, and quietly snuck out to the outdoor restroom in the back. After relieving myself, I began walking back to car when I suddenly stopped. My mother's ties. My hands flew to my neck, and sure enough, it wasn't there. Did I leave it in the car? No, I remembered playing with it as I walked inside the dhaba. I grumbling about the heavy metal chain, and thought to myself that I needed to get a strong cord instead. I sprinted back to the restroom, and dug round the dirt a bit. My panic rose, and I bit my lip to keep from crying. I looked in the restroom, and walked out and looked in a patch of weeds by the door. A glint caught my eye. I glanced over to the open back door, and I saw it lying in the back. I reached forward to grab it, and then I realized that there was no sound. No crickets were chirping. No birds flapping around in the underbrush. No rustling of leaves. At that point, every light in the dhaba went out. The driver and the owner audibly grumbled a bit, but continued their conversation. Now this isn't abnormal in rural India, but something told me that now would be a great time to get out of sight of the door and crouch. I realized that the dhaba owner and the driver had stopped talking. The dark silence was interrupted by a quick shriek from inside. I heard my driver yell a few words, and then he started to scream. Something crunched and tore. The dhaba owner let out a soft moan. Then there was the sound of the driver begging and pleading. Then he began making choking sounds and retched a couple of times. And then a sound like the snapping of a twig. I placed my hand over my mouth and shook. Every bone in my body was screaming at me to run, run, run. But where? I didn't know what was inside that dhaba, or how fast it could move, or how it looked like, or anything. I reached out for my mother's amulet and noticed that it had disappeared. I frantically looked around. It had moved again, and was now sitting by some large empty oil drums and some other rubbish. An idea flashed through my brain. I quietly creeped over to the drum, grabbed the ties, and hopped into one container. On a second thought, I pulled the heavy lid over the top and sat back and waited. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it, heavy footsteps coming towards the oil drums, and I sat there, sweat running into the small of my back. The thing actually I believe, was breathing heavily, and I could hear it snuffling around the rubbish. I willed every fiber of my being to stay still. The thing let out a low moan, and then it reached out and with a flash knocked over all of the upright oil drums at once. I didn't scream. The lid had become a little loose though, and I saw the thing for the first time. It was standing around 5 or 6 meters away from me. It was tall and thin, with a sloped back and 2 impossibly long arms. It was, and this sounds stupid, I know, a darker shade of black than I had seen before. It was darker than the shadows around it, and moved like a fluid. It didn't seem to have a defined shape. I don't know how to describe it well. I couldn't see it very clearly through the crack in the lid. Something tells me it was female. Perhaps it was the wild black hair cascading down its back that clued me in. She turned a bit and lumbered into the fields behind the dhaba, and then I saw her better in the harsh moonlight. The face was undefinable. I think at that point I saw her open her mouth lazily, as if it was yawning. The sharp teeth shone. But that wasn't the scariest part. The real horror came from what she was holding. The driver was in one of her hands. His head was bent at an impossible angle, and his eyes were wide open. Blood gushed from the stumps that used to be legs. I looked over and saw the dhaba owner lying in the doorway of the back entrance. His arm was twisted so that the elbow stuck out at a 90-degree angle. I realized that even though he was facing away from me, his head had been turned so that he was staring right into my eyes. I let out a small gasp. She moved impossibly fast. 1 second she was standing in the middle of a field. The next second, she sprinted towards the oil drums and peered into them. I saw her eyes. They were bloodshot red and filled with rage. They peered inside of the oil drum next to me. Her breaths quickened, and she grinned. She moved to my drum. I curled up as far away from the lid as possible as the thing looked through the crack between the lid and the drum. I still remember that single red eye greedily roaming the dark interior. It had a large black pupil, and she quivered with rage and hate as it scanned the can for food. There was something else about the thing, though. The rage etched into its face, the hate radiating out from its body. She contained the anger I saw on the faces of the men with guns. I realized that whatever it was that I was looking at, she was very old. She was older than any of the books my mother and father used to study. She was older than any of those gods in the shrines by the roadside. I knew, as if I had known it my entire life, that she was before the prophets and would continue to be after. Finally, she moved on to the next can. I still sat in that drum, smelling of sweat and fear, thanking whatever powers were watching over me that I had emerged unscathed. I stayed in that drum for a long time. Finally, I heard the crickets chirping again, and something took over my legs and told me to move. I pushed the lid until it popped open, and then I ran. I ran through the paddies and the fields, my suitcase flying with me. The tall grass cut at my feet, and legs and rocks ricocheted painfully against my shins, but I wasn't going to stop until I got as far away from that daba as possible. I finally came to a halt, panting, with my hands on my knees. The sun was rising, and the first rays burst over the mountain tops. It was then that I burst into tears. I knew no one here. I didn't speak the local language. I had just run into something incredibly horrible, and had almost become its lunch. But at the same time I was relieved. I was safe. My mother was watching over me from beyond, and I was going to be fine. I was going to find my way to Chandigarh, and I was never going to come back to this place. Nothing could compare to what I had just gone through. Oh, how wrong I was. Child abuse. That story wasn't even a little bit scary, Jason. And sighed disappointingly as she held her knees to her chest. She was smirking at me while sitting atop her pink duvet. Can you just shut up and go to sleep? I responded frustratedly. My attempts to scare my sister into obedience had failed yet again. She's only 9. I know. How hard could it be to scare a 9-year-old? And was that little girl who always had an answer for everything, a developing quirk in which I've grown to despise. I grumble about it, but I should have learnt my lesson by now, and had grown up sharper than most kids her age as she quickly became something of a rational thinker. I remember when she was 4, and my childish attempts to scare her. It was purely for my own amusement. It never worked. It was like she had always known that there was no such thing as monsters that hid under the bed or within her wardrobe. She easily saw through my futile attempts, whilst I was always left feeling more and more inferior. At 6 years old, and could effortlessly convert my ghosts and ghouls back into whatever they really were. Just a few boxes, clothes, and old toys. But for all her back chat and ever-increasing IQ, I had an ace up my sleeve. I was older. I've not long turned 15. This meant that when our parents were out for the night, which they often were, it was me who was in charge. It was me who had the final say. I don't want to have to come up here again. I raised my voice whilst attempting to imitate our father. However, my own delivery didn't generate the same effect or response. I didn't allow in a chance to say another word. I knew very well just how much she loved to get the last word in. I guess it must have made her feel like she'd won that particular argument or something. I wanted to snub out her idea of victory, so I quickly flicked off her bedroom light, making a swift exit before pulling the door closed behind me. Good night. I spoke without affection. I didn't feel bad about it either, as she'd been a pain in the ass all day. By this point, I had just about enough of her behavior. These babysitting duties have started to really grind me down. It's not like my parents couldn't afford a professional. They just stuck with the easiest option while saving themselves a few extra pennies in the process. After all, they knew I had nowhere else to be on a school night. Try harder next time, okay? I heard and yelled sarcastically after me, though her voice was muffled by the door. Much to my annoyance, she'd claimed the last word after all. Stupid kid, I muttered through gritted teeth as I headed back downstairs. On the way down, I gave myself a good mental kicking. Why am I so crap at telling scary stories? An old memory then sparked up from when I was a kid. I remembered the many weekends away camping we had as a family. Walking down those stairs was like walking down memory lane for me. The first few old pictures at the top were of just the three of us long before Anne arrived. I took the time to observe each one individually as they hung in wooden frames along the stairwell. A feeling of sadness and longing for better times stabbed at my heart. Everything seemed so much simpler back then, I thought, as I continued to explore my memory bank. I could recall our father's kind smile, but that's now been extracted and replaced with a foul temperament. I've put the blame for years on his bank job, and it's got progressively worse since he had that big promotion. My eyes then glazed over a singular, beautiful photo of my mother. Back then she had all the time in the world for me, but now seemingly only has eyes for Anne. I stopped at the bottom step as my gaze was drawn to a picture of the three of us around a campfire. Father must have taken this photo, as he wasn't sitting huddled with us. I think I was around 8 at the time, which made in 2. It then dawned on me that I tried telling my first ever scary story that night, though it ended up falling short of the mark. This should have been a sure sign for me to quit then and there, but I never did. I could feel myself frowning as the stern voice of my father replayed itself in my head. The ending of that story was as soft as the marshmallows were toasting Jason. I exhaled as I slid a heel off the bottom step before making my way into the living room. I'll show them, I thought to myself as I angrily skipped through the television channels, whilst my teenage mind swarmed with emotions. I claimed a shallow victory in stuffing my face with mine and Anne's leftover pizza. I'll think of something, and just you wait, making a promise to myself. In the morning, breakfast came, and went much like it usually did. I hated sitting at the table whilst having to listen to my father comment about the rising stock shares, or how overcast the weather looked that day, or watch as my mother fussed with Anne's breakfast as she'd take that extra special care in arranging the fruit on her smiling pancakes. Then there was me hastily shoveling a bowl of Frosted Flakes into my mouth. I wanted to be on my way just that little bit sooner. I tried to ignore the subtle aggravations of my sister as she went above and beyond to get my attention from across the table. I managed to obscure her annoying face behind my cereal box, but it was the flicking of her legs as she tried to kick me from under the table that prompted me to snap at her. "Stop that!" My parents paid little mind to this, as my father continued to read his broadsheet newspaper, whilst mother now started on the dishes, and was simply immune to any punishment as she rarely did anything wrong in their eyes. "She's a sweetheart, leave her alone, Jason." Or, "Stop picking on your sister, Jason." To top it all off, it was my job to walk and to her school, but I always made sure to keep a few paces ahead of her. I was thankful that our schools weren't far, perhaps a 10-minute walk at most. Our neighborhood was close to them both, although we had to walk by a couple of fields that were visible from the back of our house. Beyond that was a large forested area that linked to a neighboring town a couple of miles or so over. Despite giving me grief all morning, and still waved me off as she skipped merrily through her school gates. She seemed content in the ruining of yet another of my mornings. "See you later, bumface," and suddenly shouted as she smirked from behind the school fence. I turned with a frown to watch as she soon ran off giggling with her friends. I had a response, I honestly did, but it just came to me just that little bit too late, and was already out of earshot. So I just sighed as I swallowed my words. I popped the collar on my coat as I continued on down the path. My gaze remained on the floor as I trod upon fallen, crisp leaves. That was a sure enough sign that autumn was now in full swing. Whilst I walked the remainder of my way to my school, I took the opportunity to think more on my scariest story yet. What could I tell, and to get her finally shaking in her boots? I had imagined for a long, long time about what a victory that'd be. What I didn't imagine, however, was to be greeted on this dreary, wet morning by 2 words. "Good morning." My train of thought was disturbed as I heard the mysterious voice coming from across the road. I didn't stop, however, as I was already late for school. Though I did glance across the street as I moved, I noticed what looked to be a homeless man standing slightly obscured beside a lonely tree. "Sorry, I don't have any change," I hastily replied with the first thing that came to mind, though my tone sounded a lot less friendlier. It was a lie, of course, but the whole thing about this man standing half obscured behind a spindly tree just instantly gave me the creeps. The stranger went on to say something else, but by that time I was too far away to make any sense of it. He continued to stand there ominously, watching me move steadily out of view. As I turned down the next street, I only then registered the hairs prickling on the back of my neck. Something was definitely off about that guy, but I wouldn't let it ruin my day any further. It was more than likely just another person down on their luck looking to strike up conversation with any random passers-by. He's most probably just looking to exchange pleasantries for some pocket change, I thought. I soon met up with two of my friends, James and Luke, just outside the school. "Ready for another day in hell?" Luke commented, his freckled-dotted face forming a smirk. James was just finishing off a slice of toast. "Ugh, let's get this over with," I replied before dragging my feet to the first of many classes. I spent the majority of my day floating in and out of lessons whilst I thought about little else but the need for revenge upon my turd of a sister. It was when I was sitting in my science class that I began to really nail some ideas. I'd frantically jot them down as they sprang to mind within my old notebook. The notebook was my creative outlet of every failed story and creation. I had recorded hundreds of entries between those two black covers. It was the entire collection of my works starting from way back in my youth. My pen marked a full stop as I'd take a minute to relax my throbbing hand whilst reviewing what I'd written so far. I'd squint whilst using the tip of my pen to guide my way through the massive splurge of words I'd scribbled upon the pages. I wanted nothing more than to just come up with something good. I wanted something I could use but at the same time I wanted it today, and I wanted it quickly, but I soon realized that this mindset came at a high price. "This is shit," I exclaimed without thinking about where I was. The class all turned at once to stare at me, including my friends. My teacher, Mr. Pomfret, furrowed his brow, looking most displeased. I think it had been more about the fact I'd just interrupted another one of his boring slideshows on photosynthesis. The shouting of a swear word, however, must have come a close second, as I wound up having to stay behind during lunch to catch up on what I'd missed. "I want pages 12 to 15 completed out of your workbook by the time I come back, Jason," Mr. Pomfret said as he readied a stack of papers for the photocopier. He left shortly after. I looked through the window as I watched my fellow classmates enjoy their bout of freedom on the playground. I turned in my chair to see Luke and James waiting down behind the music block for me. That was always our place to have a cheeky smoke or to chill whilst we ate our lunches and bantered with one another. Though I was startled when I noticed something else familiar too. It was almost missable near the furthest end of the playground. It was the man from earlier that day. It at least looked like him from my one and only glance. I watched as he sat atop an old tree stump. It was situated between a few dotted trees, just on the opposite side of the school fence. He was watching the children play, his eyes frighteningly wide. A thought sprung to mind, and I instinctively felt the need to run and fetch Mr. Pomfret. But to my surprise, I instead found myself leaning in closer. I started to pay him a lot more attention now than I had done this morning. Nobody had yet to have seen him, and I hadn't seen anyone try to move him on either. My hand fidgeted with my pen as a thought then sprung to mind. Admittedly, I didn't ponder on it for long before deciding to go ahead with it. I looked around once more for any sign of my teacher before flipping open my notebook to a fresh blank page. I then started to draw the man. I didn't want to draw him exactly as he looked. I wanted to exaggerate his peculiar appearance as best I could. My newly sketched image will then become the foundations of my new story. I smiled to myself as I went about my drawing. I was feeling optimistic about this one. "This is going to be great," I muttered, sticking my tongue out in concentration, though a thought did linger in the back of my mind as I continued to sketch the lurker beyond the fence. Was it wrong what I was doing? Should I have just gone to tell someone a man was watching the playground? Absolutely, I'm not a complete idiot. This guy is more than likely sitting there with something sinister on his agenda. But just to look at him gave me the chills I required for a solid piece of fiction. I needed to capture his essence. The very air about this man screamed a horror writer's dream. I felt frustrated at myself for not giving him a proper glance earlier, but I now sat here with both the time and the means to illustrate him fully. After I'd completed something of a caricature of the Watcher, I instantly thought of a rather simplistic name for him, a name that retained a certain air of mystery about him. The Stump Man, I spoke proudly whilst writing it above my horrific sketch. I had the image, now I just needed the story to go with it. I felt a smirk creep into the corner of my mouth as I laid down my pen. It was a job well done. I glanced back up to the man beyond the fence, only to find him gone. I stood up abruptly at that as I placed my hands against the window whilst surveying the outside perimeter. I felt like a prison warden overseeing a yard of unruly inmates. I was struck with surprise to notice he'd carefully slunk down the line of fence and was now talking directly with James and Luke. They were still tucked away behind the music block, both of them completely concealed from the view of the on-duty teacher. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the exchange wasn't long. The man gestured loosely with his slender, grubby hands before the boys laughed him out of there. They seemed to dismiss him entirely as they'd walk off. The man, however, didn't look very happy at all. He'd remained there glaring at them with his hands wrenched against the bars of the fence. After another scalding from Mr. Pomfret and a less than engaging English lesson later, I finished school for another day. It was common for me and James to walk back some of the way together, as he lived not far from my sister's school. So we said our farewells to Luke at the gates before setting off. "Mate, what was up with that weird guy I saw you and Luke talk with earlier?" I dove straight into it whilst kicking a pile of leaves. "Oh, him. You saw that, huh? Silly sod tried to take us for fools. He wanted to know if we wanted to explore something he'd found in the woods after school. He was adamant we'd find it cool, but he'd only take us if we really wanted to go." James chuckled at that as he casually shook his head. "Bloody nonce, hanging around the school." "That's brilliant." I cut James off whilst fumbling to produce my notebook from my school bag. James looked utterly perplexed as he'd witnessed me scramble to find the right page before scribbling down a couple of sentences. "What the hell are you writing?" James said as he'd lean in over my shoulder to see what all the fuss was about. "The stump man." He spoke with a hint of intrigue. "You're using that guy as a basis for another story, really, Jason?" He sounded slightly aggravated before adding, "That creep really needs putting away before he does some real damage." "Yeah, I know. But what I've got now will make for my scariest story yet. You'll see. I'll see you tomorrow," I insisted as we went our separate ways. Jason was still holding on to a frown. My creation of the stump man felt close enough to reality. It felt relatable enough to get the better of in this time, and I was excited about that. It's only a Thursday, but that somehow meant another date night in our household. "Try and buy something other than pizza tonight, you got it?" my father said, extending his arm out coldly to hand me a crisp 20-pound note. "Well, maybe if you cooked for once," I muttered as I slipped the money into my back pocket. "Don't be a smart arse with me, boy." My father spoke, as if the truth was quite bothersome for him. He returned fire with a light clip around my ear with the flat of his palm. It sent a mild ringing sensation through my skull. Down the hall a much softer voice was heard. "Try and buy something with a little green on it for him, please." It was my mother. She was fussing yet again with her hair and makeup in the hallway mirror. "The taxi is out the front, Brenda," my father called out as he brushed past me towards the front door. He collected his heavy coat and wallet without so much as a good night. My mother placed her red lipstick within her purse before giving and a hug and kiss goodnight, and was already standing ready in her favorite unicorn pajamas. "I love you. We'll be back around 2200 hours, okay, darling?" she said before turning to me with a quick peck. Both of us now saddled with a faint red smudge on our foreheads. "I want it in bed and asleep by 2000 hours, no later. Do you hear me, Jason?" she added. Her voice always seemed that little bit sterner when talking to me. 2000 hours on the dot," I replied, glancing past my mother towards, and she was rubbing the loving mark off her forehead whilst glaring back at me from the bottom step. "Wonderful." Her smile was fleeting as she pulled her slender frame through the armholes of her leather jacket. She'd blow us a kiss whilst both me and caught another whiff of her potent, flowery perfume. At that she finally pulled the front door shut before promptly locking it from the outside. "I want pizza for dinner," and demanded as soon as we were alone. She poked her head once more between the railings of the stairs. "No way," I scoffed as I looked up at her. I always chose, besides, I'm the one with the money. "I think I'll order us some fried chicken instead." I laughed, knowing how much and hated the stuff. I flexed the 20-pound note out in front of her, smirking as I pinched it carefully between my fingers. I looked wholly satisfied whilst, and seemed utterly distraught. "You're such a bum-faced loser," she shouted whilst throwing a tantrum, as if she was 3 again. I heard her exhale sharply whilst doing her best to stomp up the entirety of the stairs. I could hear her persistence, as in continued trying her very best to annoy me. I knew she wanted to arouse my anger as she blared out her crappy music and made stupid noises from within her bedroom. "You'll have to try harder than that." I'd call up to her, whether she heard me or not. I then made my way into the living room, feeling rather content with how my evening was shaping up. Dinner started out a success for me, at least as I watched with a smirk as in touched nothing but her small portion of fries. She'd been poking her pieces of fried chicken around her plate for a good 10 minutes now. "Stop being a sissy and try a bit, you might actually like it," I teased, being less than playful as I peeled a piece of fried skin from a drumstick. I then began to dangle it around her now horrified face. I watched as her eyes widened whilst her disgust became prominent. "Stop it, Jason," and squealed as she suddenly leapt nimbly from her chair. She ran quickly out of the dining room and down the hallway. I was still in hot pursuit as I continued to chase her. I didn't want to let her off so quickly. My hand was still waving that dripping piece of chicken skin near the back of her ginger head, and I had no intention of letting up. I did eventually, however, as I was stopped abruptly when and also took a pause herself. From where I stood, she was now about halfway down the entrance hall. Her eyes glanced back at me before flashing a tinge of green, a spell of mischief to be sure. I watched as she positioned her dainty hands around an expensive-looking vase. The blue and red vase was our grandmother's, gifted between generations as an heirloom of sorts. It's by far our father's favorite decoration in this entire house. It stood proudly upon a white plinth, whilst immaculate in its presentation. "Don't you do it, Anne," I blurted out as my voice was unable to cover my worry. "That's too far," I called out again as the feeling of being powerless washed over me. "Oops," and didn't even hesitate as she single-handedly sentenced me to an unrivaled scalding from our father. I knew they'd never have believed that she could have done this after all. I just watched whilst my eyes widened as Anne shoved the pristine object from the platform. I let out a voiceless cry. I watched it in slow motion as it plummeted towards the hard floor. A loud crash was heard as both of us winced in unison. We saw pieces of it scatter upon impact. "Anne!" I yelled. I felt as if I had turned a shade of red myself. My blood boiled as I gripped her arm tightly. She protested and struggled as I stormed her up the stairs. "You're hurting me, Jason," she whimpered as I pushed her into her room. "I'm sorry, okay. I'll tell Mom and Dad it was me." Her voice was now trembling. She'd never seen me this angry before. But I didn't care for her pleas as I marched to my bedroom and picked up my notebook. I didn't think two ways about it at this point. I returned to her, but to my surprise, and was already sitting up under her duvet. She attempted to appease me by putting herself to bed early. "What's that?" she'd ask with a tone of worry mixed with intrigue, her hand pointing at my notebook. Silently I flipped it open. I used my thumb to skim the pages before jabbing a finger down upon the one I wanted. Then I began. "Have you ever heard of the Stump Man?" Though my voice is still heavy with anger, I'd always try to add a certain flair to my storytelling. And simply shook her head. She'd scoot back towards her pillows as she'd watch me, her eyes peeking a little above her duvet. "I don't want to hear one of your scary stories tonight. I just want to go to sleep." She spoke as her voice became little more than a whisper. "He lives not far from here. In fact, he's just out there, in those woods." I'd continue whilst moving around the room. I'd throw back her spotty curtains, exposing her bedroom to the darkness of the fields that lay just beyond our garden. "Jason, please stop it. I'll go straight to sleep." And continued, now clutching tight her purple teddy bear as she'd follow my gaze out the window. "Under a rotten old tree stump. That's where he lives, you see. He crawls out in search of his next victim to snatch with his long gangly arms." I'd go on to say my reading was passionate. I felt the hard work starting to pay off. "But the thing is about the Stump Man dash. Jason, please," and shouted. She'd cut me off mid-sentence. My sister was clearly disturbed enough to shorten my efforts and gladly put herself to bed. I was finally winning. I quickly reminded myself of the utter disaster this little turd had made for me downstairs. So I pressed my finger to the line I'd last started before continuing regardless. "But the thing about the Stump Man is, he only skulks where he's wanted, and he'll only come creeping around if he's summoned, and he's particularly fond of naughty children." I'd moved towards the window again as my hand pulled down the handle. I'd proceed to swing the window wide open. I could hear and begin to quietly sob. She hadn't long pulled her duvet completely over her head to mask her obvious fear. Though I felt no shame in it, I'd waited for this day. It was the day I'd be able to deliver a little payback of my own. And I had every intention to finish what I started. "Oh, Stump Man!" I called for the monster across the fields and through the forest beyond. I utilized my script word for word. I expressed to my fullest potential the playful yet stern call. The same call that I'd practiced religiously on my walk home from school that day. I wanted it to sound perfect. I slowly crept away from the window, carefully moving around the bed as I knelt down by the side of the pink mound of bedding that was my sister. He'd have heard that one especially. Don't you think so? I seem to have transformed my voice for that particular part into something truly disturbing. I stood up again, pausing at the constant sound of crying now coming from beneath the duvet. I'd come too far to stop now, though admittedly I'd missed a whole chunk of what I wanted to say. In that particular moment, I became annoyed at myself for letting and shelter away so quickly into my story. I sighed at that while speeding up to my grand finale. I'd bring my hand to the page that harbored the monstrous picture from my notebook. I'd tear it out before placing it thoughtfully on Anne's nightstand. The menacing visage of the Stump Man, now aglow from her white rainbow light. "Sleep tight," I'd whisper as my payback was now complete. Turning, I left her bedroom. This was my victory march, and it was hailed by the sound of Anne's terrified sobbing. The feeling was short-lived, as I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess downstairs. I was a little more than nervous for how this'll all play out when my parents return. I went to bed early, as I was hoping they wouldn't confront me about it until the morning. Anne's room was deadly quiet as I walked past, but I smiled to myself at that. It truly was a pleasant change. I hardly had time to dream that night, before I was awoken by a soft noise coming from the foot of my bed. "Jason, I am scared." I was startled suddenly awake, my vision blurred as I leant across to flick on my bedside light. The small dark inspector standing at the bottom of my bed became highlighted. It was revealed to be Anne, her eyes red and puffy from excessive crying. She was clutching her purple teddy bear close to her chest. Please can I sleep in with you? Mother and father aren't home yet." I groaned at that, squinting as I looked at my alarm clock reading 22:30. I sighed. My parents were indeed late home again. But what seemed to have bothered me more was my subsiding dislike for my sibling. I figured it must have nulled slightly in my sleep. "Ugh, what's up? Is this about the Stump Man thing? That's just a story, and I made that all up to finally scare you silly. Just go back to sleep," I murmured as I turned over to face away from her, hoping she got the message, but it turned out to be quite the opposite. She moved up next to me before crawling over my covers as she made her way into the opposite side of my bed. I protested with my eyes still half closed, but to my own surprise I allowed it. She wasn't big after all. In fact, it was her chunky purple teddy bear that took up more room. "And this isn't funny. We've got school tomorrow and I need to sleep." I mumbled half asleep as I shifted to turn back around and away from her. I then leant across to turn off my bedside light. "I don't want to sleep in my room tonight." I didn't respond. Instead, I settled back down before closing my eyes. Minutes must have passed, as I had almost fallen back into a peaceful sleep. When Anne finally whispered again, and what she said sent a cold spell down my spine. "It's the Stump Man, he's outside. He's in the garden by the back fence." "What did you say?" I spoke, my eyes now wide open, my brow furrowed in clear confusion. I tilted my head back towards her, and now obscured once more in the dark. He just waved at me, though, as if he was asking me to come down. He looked at me with his big yellow eyes and long arms, just like your drawing. I shut the window and came straight in here. Please don't be mad at me." "I'm not mad, I'm Dash. Just go to sleep, Anne." I insisted, as if trying to mask my own growing concerns, as I mentally retraced the actions I made of locking down the house before bedtime. I felt secure enough in my routine, though Anne's never been like this before, ever. She didn't speak to me again after that. It turns out she had fallen asleep with her feet entangled with mine, despite my attempts to pry them apart during the night. I stayed awake for a while longer, as I was entirely perplexed by what she told me. A thought crossed my mind that this was perhaps the start of something new. I thought it was actually the makings of an apology from, and for what she had done tonight. I then spared a lasting thought about what I did to her in return. I felt that forgotten pang of guilt echo in my heart. Tomorrow is a new day. I thought to myself before finally closing my eyes. Jason, get down here now. I awoke just before my alarm as I yawned and stretched out a small kink in my back. It was my mother. She was calling me from downstairs. And by her voice, she didn't sound pleased at all. I looked around to find myself alone, and must have already left for breakfast. You'll have some explaining to do to your father when he gets home tonight, Mother stated as she placed a bowl of cereal in front of me. We're absolutely livid with you. Do you know how old that vase was? Well, do you? She'd continue to scowl whilst hastily preparing Anne's lunchbox. That's when I finally noticed, and she'd never been so quiet before in all her life. She looked almost statue-like as she'd sit there staring blankly at the table. I'm sorry, Mother. I replied without genuine thought as my concern fell ultimately upon my sister. Eat up, darling. My mother spoke as her tone returned to normal. She didn't seem to notice the obvious change as she gently placed her favorite pancakes out in front of her. Now I've got to pop out to do some shopping, so you'll have to see yourselves off to school today. Mother shouted down the hall as she grabbed her handbag and keys. She entered the kitchen once more only to swiftly peck and upon the side of her head. I'd received a glare in passing as she soon made her way out the front door. I saw him again, and finally spoke as she'd lift her gaze from her plate to me. The stump man. I responded with my mouth half full with cereal. You need to let that go, and he isn't real, it's just a made-up story. He is real. He was standing behind our tree in the garden. I saw him when I went to brush my teeth. He waved at me again. I stopped eating, and before long I found myself standing by the back door. I didn't know what to think as I peered out into our dismal garden. I looked for a long time. I wanted to see what she was seeing. However, I didn't see any sign of anyone. I walked side by side with, and on the way into school. Much to my surprise, she even grasped for my hand as we walked past the fields. To my even greater surprise, I let her. Will you walk home with me today? And asked as we stopped for a moment outside her school gates. Don't you want to walk home with your friends? I replied, though I tried not to sound too enforcing. No, I'll be waiting for you, please don't be late. Her voice sounded scared as her eyes moved between me and the surrounding area. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing between the quiet road and trees. Okay, I'll be here, I promised her before letting out an audible grunt and rushed into my stomach for a hug. Thank you, I'm sorry for being mean to you all the time. That's okay. I'm sorry for being mean too. I'll see you later, okay? I then watched as she walked off into her school. She turned to wave at me again before heading inside. She'd missed the bell today for the first time in her schooling career. I smiled slightly at that, unaware that this was the last time I'd ever see her again. I rushed home from school after her teacher sent out a distress call. One of their pupils had been reported missing around lunchtime. Police were already at our house long before I got there. My stomach dropped as it became painfully obvious that the girl who was missing was Anne, my little sister. I saw Father trying to console Mother at the dinner table. They were surrounded by 2 officers insisting on any information on the possible whereabouts of their daughter. But little did they know I already had all the information they needed. I've had it since yesterday when I first heard him say, "Good morning." I should have said something, Jason was right, but I needed the scariest story. Didn't I? The police never did find out what happened to my sister. She'd simply vanished without any leads or trace. But I knew exactly where she was. She was in the nearby forest under an old rotten stump. She was snatched by the stump man. I was tucking my daughter into bed one night last week. Normally, she's a huge hassle to make go to bed, but that night she seemed actually eager to go to sleep. I sat down in the chair beside her bed and asked her what story she wanted me to read. She smiled at me, but didn't say anything. Smiley shark? I asked. No, I can read with my eyes shut. No, well, what would you like me to read? I want to tell a story tonight, she exclaimed with an enthusiasm I was unused to. Oh, you've got a story, do you? I said, let's hear it then. She scrambled out from under her covers and climbed into my lap. It's about a man, she said, looking at me with a sudden intensity. Every night he walks down the street. He wears a big, red coat. In his pockets, he's got a paper with a list of names on it. She lowered her voice to a whisper briefly. It's a list of bad children. They threw a tantrum, or they dumped their dinner on the floor, or they smacked their little sister on the face and made her cry. You mean Santa Claus? I asked. No. Let me finish my story. Okay, I'm sorry. He walks down a different street every night. He's got his list of kids and what bad things they done that day. Sometimes he ends up walking down the street where one of those bad kids lives. If he does, he stops at their house. He doesn't have to check his list. He just knows who's on it and if it's their house. If he comes to your house, she said, pointing at me, he'll open the front door, even if it's locked. He comes in and looks at the photos of you on the walls. He goes into your bedroom and stands by your bed. His hands are always in his pockets because his fingers are really long and scare people. But when he finds you, he takes his hands out of his pockets and covers your face with them. She demonstrated this to me by putting her own small hands over her face. He puts his hands on your face so you can't breathe. You can't even feel him doing it 'cause you're asleep. He keeps them there till you're dead. Then he takes his list out and crosses your name off for it. Then he leaves and nobody knows he was even there. She concluded the awful tale by crossing her arms and declaring matter-of-factly, "That's why you gotta be good every day, 'cause you never know if the man in the red coat is gonna walk down your street that night." We sat there beside her bed in silence for a moment. She beamed proudly, while I felt like all the blood was draining from my head. "That's a scary story," I finally said. "Only if you're a bad kid," she replied. I wondered how confidently she'd have said those words if she'd thrown one of her usual tantrums that day. It suddenly occurred to me that she'd been particularly well-behaved all night, and wondered if this macabre story was the key. I tucked her in with a hug and a kiss, and went to trade places with my wife, who was dealing with our other daughter, a toddler who won't go to sleep unless you snuggle her for about an hour. Later, with both kids down, I sat on the couch with my wife while she watched one of her shows and asked during a commercial, "Did Katie tell you her story?" "No, we read Little House in the Big Woods." "Did you tell her a story about a man who kills bad children?" "Of course not." The show came back on, so nothing more was said on the subject, but it nagged at me the rest of the night. As passionate as I am about horror, I make sure to pad any scary stories I tell my daughter with a bit humor. I don't want her afraid of the dark. I just want to nurture her imagination and creativity, you know? The next day we were drawing together. She likes to have me draw cartoon characters, and then she colors them in with her crayons. At one point, she came up and held a piece of paper over her face and yelled "B-O-O" at me while I was at my desk. She had drawn this cartoony kind of face on her own. It looked to me somewhat like Ernie from Sesame Street. "Is that me?" I asked. "No. Who is that?" She paused for a moment, as if trying to come up with a name. "It's a zombie," she finally declared. "Oh, scary. What's that line coming out of its mouth?" "That's its tongue." She drew me another picture after that. I thought it was a female version of the same face, but she had added a smaller drawing of a head beside it. I took both these drawings to work and have them hanging up by my desk. A few nights later, after we had gotten her ready for bed, she declared to me once again that she had a story to tell me. I set down the books I had pulled from her shelf and sat down in the chair by her bed. Once again, she crawled into my lap, sat up straight, and looked me right in the eyes. "Is it about the man in the red coat?" I asked. "No, it's about a mommy. Does she have a good little girl or a bad little girl?" "She's got a little boy, but then she died and the daddy and the little boy moved away." "That's a depressing story. She looks for him every night." "I thought you said she died?" She just looked at me, and I could see in her eyes that she was not making this story up as she went, but reciting it to me and trying to figure out the answer to my question. She put her hand on her chin for a moment in an almost grown-up way. "She's a ghost," she finally declared. "Oh, well, that makes sense." She came back to her home, but her little boy was gone, so she went looking for him. "Did she find him?" "No, she's always looking. She can't drive a car, so she's gotta walk, and it's real far, and she doesn't even know where to go. So she just walks. She's got blood on her feet 'cause her feet get hurt from all the walking. If she hears a baby crying, she starts crying too. Sometimes she'll cry for hours after hearing a baby cry. If she sees a child out at night, she gets confused and thinks it's her little boy. She'll run up and try to grab the little kid right out of its parents' arms. If the kid is alone, she'll snatch it up and carry it off. Those ones are never found. She always comes back 'cause she hasn't found her boy. She might not even recognize him anymore 'cause she's been dead for so long. How long has she been dead? I asked. A long time, Katie replied, shaking her head. How did she die? I don't really know why I asked that question. She cut herself and then lost all her blood. That was too much. I didn't like that she knew these stories. I was upset that someone had told her these awful things. Who told you that story? I asked in my most serious voice. She looked away for a moment, and I thought I had frightened her with my tone. It took me a moment to realize she was looking at the window on the far end of her bed. Outside it was dark, but I could see the trees at the edge of our backyard being blown about by the wind. I waited, then shook her slightly to break the spell that the window seemed to have her under. Who told you? I repeated. She suddenly looked scared and upset, like she was going to cry. I'm sorry, she wailed and hugged me tightly. Sorry for what? I asked, rubbing her back gently to calm her. Her little hands gripped my shirt, and I realized she was shaking. For, she sniffed. For talking to strangers. Please don't get mad. Please don't let the man with the red coat find me. I hugged her even tighter. You weren't bad. Nothing's going to happen to you. What stranger did you talk to? The man who came to my window. He told me the stories. Her words made me freeze. We live on the second floor of a duplex. I got up, setting my daughter on her bed. She cried and begged me not to leave, but I hushed her. I walked across the room to the window. It was shut, but the wind was howling so fiercely you could hear it through 2 panes of glass. Outside, across the backyard, was dense woods. The trees seemed to shake their branches at me menacingly. What did he look like? I said, trying to sound calm. He looks like in my drawing. I thought about the drawings she had made. I get chills even now as I look at it and write this. That simple line for a tongue suddenly seemed snake-like to me. Those eyes a little too frightening. She had drawn people before, but they never had the same look as these drawings. That's when I noticed the marks on the window's glass. It looked like something sharp had been dragged down it, like the edge of a coin or a rock. For jagged lines, a finger's space apart, crisscrossing repeatedly in one spot against the window. And at the bottom, for deep grooves in the wooden pane.